Hi guys, how is everyone doing today? Well, in this video presentation, we are going to focus on grammar instruction. This topic is actually very interesting for me, especially since we are in a context in Mexico that is apparently a country that really loves teaching grammar. So let's see what is there to read and to know. Welcome. An introduction to this topic, we are going to see certain topics to realize where we are standing on. Well, as you already know, probably, the subject of teaching grammar has been very controversial in research since a very long time. Sometimes we have people or different views. Some people say that we should focus all the attention on grammar, while there are other people that say that we shouldn't focus any attention at all. If you remember from the other presentations, we were discussing about this theorist named Krashen. In the 80s, he said that actually we didn't have to teach any grammar. He also said that the most effective form of grammar instruction was only to allow learners to acquire the grammar on the language implicitly through exposure to comprehensible input tuned to their level. This way, students could actually engage because this would be meaningful for them. 15 years later, Ellis supported his idea again, but now he called it the zero option. This meant that he agreed with Krashen, but zero grammar was kind of a problem, don't you think? In 2001, then came the theorist Long, and he said that we have to have some kind of focus on form. This means that we have to focus on grammar because it was necessary to accelerate the process of grammar acquisition and also to raise ultimate levels of attainment. What do we understand by grammar? Well, there are two different perspectives. The first one is considered to be like the most traditional one, while the second one has to do with more recent research. The first perspective sees grammar as the knowledge of the system of rules which speakers apply in order to form correct sentences in spoken and written production. On the other hand, on the second perspective, grammar is seen more of a skill which speakers deploy creatively in acts of speech. When we say acts of speech, remember that it's like whatever we want to say. If we want to make a question, if we want to make a suggestion, like the different ways in which language exists. Now, there's a reality about these two perspectives. The differences will reflect the kind of grammar instruction that a teacher uses inside the classroom. For example, the kind of materials that we are going to use are going to be related to the perspective that we agreed on. If we are language teachers and we are more traditional, that means that the first view is the one that we are going to consider when we are planning our grammar classes. So this means that our grammar instruction is going to be reflected in exercises and test items, often at sentence level. This regarding the correct application of the rules for the achievement of accuracy. If you are a more modern teacher with a more modern view of English teaching, that means that you are going to use the second view as your source of inspiration to plan your grammar classes. So, in your classes, you will find expressions in exercises and test items which regard the learner's ability to make appropriate grammatical choices for the achievement of meaningful texts. If you think about it, of course, the second view is one that is more complete because you are allowing students to make choices. You are giving them a more active role inside the classroom, and of course, if you allow them to think, this is always going to be more meaningful for them, and it's where they are going to show you if they are actually learning or not. Now, you need to consider that we have these two perspectives, but remember, you don't have to marry one of them. You have to understand them, and from this, you have to create your own knowledge and even create your own perspective. The intention is that you teach grammar whenever is necessary, using the first perspective or the second perspective as inspiration, whatever you want. The thing is that you will be the teacher in front of the classroom, and you are responsible for making the right decisions when it comes to teaching. Lexis and phonology, along with grammar, is a communicative resource. This means that speakers use these lexis, phonology, and grammar to communicate and to comprehend and interpret language they receive. This is also called input, for example, when they are reading or listening, and it is called output when they are producing language, and this occurs in speech or writing for communicative purposes. This also is called, we have two different skills. One is decoding and the next one is encoding. Decoding is when you are receiving messages, so input, and encoding is the opposite, when you are producing language, which is output. The notion of grammar as a system of choices that speakers or writers make, for example, whether to use an active or passive verb form, or whether to use a modal can or could when making a request. These choices are not made in a vacuum, but in a context of language, in language use. We need to have in mind that our students are going to make these choices inside a context. For example, they are going to make these choices in a conversation with friends or probably when they are writing an email to a colleague. In each of these situations, there is a text that is being created and there is an audience that has to be taken into account. Secondly, there is a view that grammar is at the service of the user, rather than a linguistic straitjacket that speakers are forced to wear. This means that grammar should be considered as a dynamic system, which permits adaptation of its rules by speakers for their own communicative purposes and which is consequently subject to change over time. Remember, grammar is always moving. Grammar is always moving because it's part of language, which is a being. When we are language teachers, our practice needs to be informed by what we know about, for example, how grammar is learned. In this slide, we are going to focus our attention in three processes that involve language learning and which have been established by research studies in second language acquisition and discuss some of the implications for teaching. The first process says, learners need to be able to notice features of grammar in natural, realistic context of use. Noticing refers to the process of the learner picking out specific features of the target language input which he or she hears or reads and paying conscious attention to them so they can be fed into the learning process. This involves making connections between grammatical features noticed and their associated meanings, functions, and contexts of use. In other words, we need to expose learners to real materials. I don't know, if we are working with grammar, instead of having a classic class, a traditional class, where I show them how certain topic of grammar works, I would show them a text that has the grammatical feature that I want them to learn. This way, they are in touch with the real material, with the grammar appearing in real context, and this way they can create connections that are more meaningful and start to understand grammar in a different way and also in a different level. The second process says, learners need opportunities to form hypotheses about how grammar works. Forming hypotheses about how grammar works is part of the wider cognitive processes of structuring and restructuring. When we talk about cognitive processes, that means that we are concerned about how people are learning something. For example, in this case, whereby learners discern patterns in the forms of language, they have noticed and formed working hypotheses about how the system works, hypotheses which they modify and actually refine over time. In this way, input becomes internalized as intake. Grammar instruction can accelerate the process by helping the learner form useful working hypotheses through various kinds of consciousness-raising tasks. So, in other words, instead of presenting again grammar, doing the whole teaching about grammar, we need to present the students with certain sentences or certain materials where they can see the opportunities to be faced to grammar, and they have to create hypotheses of why language is behaving in a certain way. For example, if you are teaching them the simple present, you should allow and guide the students to understand why sometimes we have an extra S in the verb. Of course, we are going to allow students to form hypotheses and tell us, well, the S appears when we have the pronoun he, she, or it. That's what it means. The third process says, learners need opportunities to practice using grammar in meaningful contexts. This is very controversial because it is probably true that practice of a grammatical pattern before the learners have had sufficient opportunity to understand how something works is of little use for meaningful, long-lasting learning. Well, practice is still an essential element for the process of automatization, it's actually really important to practice with the students. If you don't give them the chance to practice using the grammatical feature that you are teaching them, of course they will never have the chance to make mistakes. It's really important that they make mistakes, so we guide them through correcting those mistakes in order for them to learn the grammatical topic correctly. There are some distinctions between different approaches to teaching grammar. The most important to notice is the difference between product approach and process approach. In a product approach, actually, this one focuses on forms, which focuses on grammar, the emphasis is on the component parts of the grammatical system, which are divided up and taught one after another. An item of grammar is pre-selected for attention in any given lesson or for practice in a given exercise, and thereby becomes the target structure, the object, the product of learning. If you think about it, most of us who have learned English in a more traditional way, this is the approach that our teachers probably were using. They were following a syllabus and they were giving us grammar contents according to that syllabus, following an order and following always some sort of a structure. In a process approach, on the other hand, the emphasis is on grammar as an element in the process of language use, so that the focus of a given lesson is not on a particular pre-selected grammatical structure, but on the learner's own skills in applying his or her grammatical repertoire in doing a given task. If you think about this second approach, it's a more modern approach. It's an approach where teachers are not pre-selecting the topics that learners are going to learn. They are actually taking into account learners' needs and interests in learning a language. And if you think about it, this is amazing because you are not prejudging anyone. You are actually giving your students what they are asking, what they actually need in the language that they are learning. And well, as you remember, some of you presented the famous PPP. This is an approach that is widely practiced when we are teaching grammar. And if you remember, the three P's mean presentation, practice, and production. In this approach, the learning process of noticing, structuring, and making some sort of automatization are developed through an ordered sequence of 3 stages. Again, those 3 stages are presenting, practicing, and producing. In this presentation, we have discussed generally the knowledge of the process by which grammar is learned. And we have discussed several options that experts, theorists, and researchers have found over the time. Grammar is probably the way we think about language, and I think that grammar receives a lot of attention in our classrooms. When I say that grammar receives a lot of attention is because we are more concerned about teaching grammar than the other aspects of language. Teaching explicit grammar for me, it's not the best option. Explicit grammar should only be taught when it is completely necessary. We should allow that implicit grammar occurs inside our classrooms, inside the materials that we choose for our students. This way, learning the language becomes more natural. Of course, it's never going to be the same or completely natural, but it's really important that we as the teachers guide the students through a more natural and realistic scenario of the language.